During an episode of At the Movies, film critics Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert talked about a number of then recently released slasher films and just how much they didn't like them. They called films such as When a Stranger Calls, Friday the 13th and Prom Night violent, extreme, grotesque and nauseating, and more importantly, a misogynistic and conservative response to the rising success of the women's liberation movement.
Roger Ebert would continue the discussion by saying the now infamous quote,
"These films hate women, and unfortunately the audiences that go to them don't seem to like women too much either."
This generic statement, which was biased, to a degree untrue, and at least a little demeaning to the countless female academics interested in the horror genre, has been the subject of much conversation since the episode's release.
You ever notice how the people saying that horror is misogynistic are usually people who don't experience misogyny?
Since through this statement, Ebert associates the horror genre with inherently conservative ideas of what is essentially a violent patriarchy without proper nuance or discussion embedded in the text. But this idea is thoroughly problematized by the genre's well-established relationship with an expansive socio-political climate, as well as a consistent and long-standing relationship that queer people have always had with horror.
In a study conducted by Nielsen, it was revealed that LGBT moviegoers marginally favour the horror genre and are 22% more likely to choose a horror film over any other. Harry Benshoff writes that horror is especially attractive for queer people because of the metaphorical non-realist forms and narrative formats which disrupts the heterosexual status quo, echoing later discussed theories regarding horror and slasher cinema from Clover and Wood. Queer people also make up a large percentage of online writing, academia, and fandom spaces dedicated to the horror genre, and even create memes, the gay Babadook and Mothman is a gay icon for examples, to represent the intersection of gayness and horror.
This is part 1 of a 5-part series which discuss 4 emblematic horror movies of the last 40 years, the socio-political climate that they were released in, and what significant attributes they all have that makes them queer. In this video essay, however, I'll be discussing the background of horror before the slasher film format in the late 70s and 1980s, their own socio-political implications, and the aspects of each decade which makes them queer, while also discussing why horror is so well loved by queer audiences. Because it is. We really, really love our horror. Before I properly start this essay though, I'd like to define and perhaps defend my use of the term queer. To many, though it operates as what is effectively a reclaimed slur, the term queer from a theoretical standpoint encompasses many relevant theories, such as gender theory, feminist theory, as well as gay and lesbian theory.
It could be argued that queer theory and queerness as a whole is generally considered to be anything that goes against what is considered the norm, therefore cisgender and heterosexual. It welcomes the open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excess of meanings when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. To bring this back to horror theory, when Clover and Wood write about the horror genre, they write it as opposing that which is respectable, what is heterocentric and cisnormative, and the same thing could easily be said about queerness.
Queer theory and horror theory are alike because they both oppose heteronormative ideology as a default. Indeed, the monster is to normality as homosexual is to heterosexual.
To elaborate on the intersection of queerness and horror, in case you're not too Babashook yet, John Paul Brammer said the Babadook was a fitting metaphor for queer people's potential roles under the Trump administration. We will be the antagonists.
This statement not only validates gay and queer people's consistent identification with the horror genre, but also places the current period of identification amongst a long history of queer readings of horror cinema and literature.
Beginning the cinematic history of horror, the 1920s and 30s saw a rise of the monster movie, the other, the abnormal, the outsider or the foreigner, invading spaces where they did not belong, intercepting high society and plunging it into chaos. Greatly influenced by the Gothic literature from which they were adapted, these films would represent the other as either a foreign body or a developing one, a body that cannot be controlled and is rebelling against the mind, which in many ways reflects a kind of coming out narrative. Dracula, as a character and foremost example of this, acts as a foreign body on English soil. easily controlling and seducing women and overpowering men through his own dangerous charisma. In this vein, the metaphorical other body could potentially be the queer body. Spanning across the month of October in 1998, San Francisco's Castro Theatre, famous as a cinematic landmark for queer filmmaking throughout the 1970s, held a screening of the original Universal monster movies restored for the modern cinema screen.
Responding to these screenings, Gary Morris wrote about the barely disguised and downright queer readings that these films could potentially have through a retrospective lens.
Despite their frightening initial releases through the 20s and 30s, films such as The Phantom of the Opera, Dracula, Frankenstein and The Invisible Man have acquired an air of campy kitsch to them in our cultural zeitgeist, both in their theatrical roots and aesthetics.
Indeed, while horror is a subversive and therefore appealing area for camp and kitsch ideas to develop, this kitsch also comes from the level of queer subtext these films possess.
Not only are they decadently camp, they generally centre around the homosexual relationships between men and monsters, and how these monsters, often embodied as threatening but attractive well-groomed men, disrupt and threaten their respectable, heterosexual and cis-normative opposition. Dracula additionally raises ideas of authorial insertion and the value of queer authorship in horror texts, such as writers have speculated on Bram Stoker, Dracula's author, potentially being gay. Schaeffer argues that Dracula explores Stoker's fear and anxiety as a closeted homosexual man, and indeed, this fear can be read into Dracula, particularly when examining Dracula's complete and utter dominance over Jonathan Harker, which in turn disrupts the heterocentric narrative of the film and places the text within queer horror discussion.
Additionally, much of the Universal Monster timeline was directed by a gay director, James Whale. His films, especially The Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein, have retroactively been interpreted as queer texts.
The Invisible Man metaphorically represents society's invisible man as its homosexual man, effeminate, dangerous when naked, seeking a male partner in crime, and becoming visible only when shot by the police.
Russo writes about Frankenstein, saying the vision both films had of the monster was of an antisocial figure in the same way that gay people were things that should not have happened, and the film is often read as queer because of the homosocial dynamic between Pretorius and Henry Frankenstein.
Indeed, Bride of Frankenstein and her conception of the hands of two men can be eloquently summed up as the majesty and power of the homosexual creator.
Reading the Universal Monster films as queer is important for a myriad of different reasons.
Firstly, it validates a long history of reading cinematic horror texts and narratives through a queer lens, and successfully demonstrates the strength of the queer community's relationship with horror since its cinematic origins. Secondly, it demonstrates the horror genre's long-standing relationship with queer creators, with queer directors and actors working within horror since the 1920s. Thirdly, the Universal monster films have a long and prestigious literary, theatrical and cinematic history. Being able to read these texts as queer secures queer readings as on the level of this prestige and heritage among their authors.
Finally, these films should be centralised not only within the horror canon, but also to the Universal Studio itself.
Throughout the 20s, Universal was nearing collapse as a result of the Great Depression, but following the successful releases of Phantom of the Opera in 1925 and Dracula in 1931, the monster and horror genre effectively saved Universal from financial collapse.
Therefore, reading queer subtext into these seminal canonical texts and situating gay men at the forefront of the development of these films roots queer people in the cinematic tradition of horror and places queer theory as an element among horror theories since the beginning of horror cinema.
He did the Monster Mash. The Monster Mash.
Following the monster movies of the 1930s, the 1940s and 50s saw a rise of horror based in science fiction, with themes of alien invasion and monsters central to both A-list and B-list pictures. Often nicknamed creature features, these films were released during a period of geopolitical tension between North America and the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and are thought to echo anxieties surrounding communism, government surveillance, and nuclear annihilation. Wood dismisses the 1950s horror canon as an essentially reactionary period in horror, but Steiner and Jankovic argue differently. They instead state that it was a period in which horror was shifting away from a reliance upon Gothic horror and towards a preoccupation with the modern world.
It is perhaps the 50s that encapsulates the fears and anxieties of broader society more than any other period of horror filmmaking.
This period in particular is emblematic of the queer community's long-running involvement in camp. While difficult to pinpoint a specific definition, camp can be a style and sensibility that regards something as appealing because of its bad taste and ironic value.
Tragically ludicrous? The ludicrously tragic?
Oh, yeah, like when a clown died.
Like the Universal monsters, these films are now praised for their high camp appeal, as defined by Susan Sontag, playful, anti-serious. The queer community has a long-standing relationship with camp and camp aesthetics. Therefore, associating these texts with camp appeal associates them with queerness. As the popularity of creature features and alien invasion films of the 1950s started to dwindle amongst audiences, horror in the 1960s began to develop into a legitimate form of cinema, with major actors and directors working within the genre. With many films embedded in the Gothic literature of the 1930s, e.g. The Haunting and The Innocents, and twisting the well-known creature features of the previous decade, e.g. Night of the Living Dead and The Birds, horror in the 1960s displayed an interest in the genre's potential for psychological nuance.
However, while horror was developing a level of prestige through this era, there was some films that were displaying a subtle shift or a queering in what audience understood about the genre.
Both Psycho and Peeping Tom effectively inspired much of the horror that would come decades later by becoming proto-slasher films. And while this is particularly clear in later decades, the 1960s saw a rise in the televisual coverage of gruesome deaths and murders within North America, and many films during this era played off the nationwide paranoia amongst their audiences. Beginning with the violent killings from the Manson family that spanned through the late 60s and into the early 70s, the 70s would be loaded with nationwide coverage of a number of notorious serial killers and mass murders. Nationwide doubts about the government and authority started to bloom as a result of the Vietnam War and the turbulent Nixon presidency. The films that followed this slew of publicly displayed violence and terror were darker, more violent, and often deeply cynical, if not downright nihilistic. So saw the rise of exploitation filmmaking, films that, while not praised or particularly respected by critics, essentially queered or subverted audiences' notions of what horror could be, since these films were often cheaply made by independent filmmakers and explored current trends, niche genres, or lurid content.
And while many films fell under the exploitation umbrella, the most notable and notorious of the subgenres would become the slasher film. Thought to have been popularised by the proto-slashers of the 1960s and the exploitation and grindhouse cinema of the 1970s, the slasher genre takes influence from the extremist theatre of the Grand Guignol and Italian giallo filmmaking.
Generally, a slasher film will centre itself around narratives concerning a shadowy blade-wielding killer responding to an event by stalking and murdering the members of a youth group before the threat they pose is neutralised. And though some films have played with this definition, often this narrative is fairly strict. Both Black Christmas and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre have often cited as the first slasher films, though it wouldn't be until what critics, Kershwell and Decker, call the golden age of slasher that the subgenre would demand particular media focus. This golden age boasts canonical horror texts such as Halloween, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, and would later include metatextual texts such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. The concept of metatextuality, or being cleverly self-referential, existing within the slasher subgenre establishes it as cinematically relevant, with established and culturally recognisable tropes.
These films, as well as others released during this period, are iconic and emblematic of the slasher film genre, as they have not only been registered into the cultural zeitgeist, but they have also demonstrated the popularity and financial importance of texts generally dismissed by academics and critics.
Carol Clover writes about the slasher genre, citing it as the very bottom of the cinematic underbrush and the horror of horrors, in comparison to texts that have achieved reputability within the context of disreputability. She goes on to say that the slasher film lies by and large beyond the purview of the respectable middle-aged, middle-class audiences. Wood echoes similar theories about the slasher film and defends the genre, saying, however one may shrink from systematic exposure to slasher films, however one may deplore the social phenomena and ideological mutations they reflect, their popularity suggests that even if they are uniformly execrable, they shouldn't be ignored.
Both of these writers acknowledge the fact that the slasher film is often dismissed because of the genre's tendency to warp and oppose the ideology that centralises respectable, white, patriarchal, puritanical and heterocentric audiences. Wood goes further and writes that slasher films, in fact, smash the norms that oppress us and which our moral conditioning teaches us to revere. Because of these supporting theories, slasher films can be adroit texts to read through lenses that often oppose these norms and audiences, therefore ripe for queer readings.
Exploitation cinema as a genre was created as a means of exploring and displaying lurid or sensationalist and trashy content, which made it an appealing genre for queer directors to show a vision not associated with the mainstream. John Waters is often heralded as one of the most influential exploitation film directors, and his films were often a campy, extravagant reaction to the news and politics of the 60s and 70s. Since slasher films have their roots in exploitation cinema and continue to base themselves in the ideas and aesthetics of the genre, it can be argued that slasher films films disassociate themselves from the mainstream ideas of the horror genre. They change the dynamics of what is established within horror cinema and push the boundaries of what audiences might find acceptable on screen. Additionally, the slasher genre, or indeed slasher villains themselves, disrupt icons of North American normativity: heterosexual couples, heterosexual sex, suburbia, the prom.
What is to be expected of traditional cinema, a male lead, a heterosexual romance, a happy ending, is often disrupted in the slasher films, which means that it queers the audience expectations of cinema itself.
The majority of canonical slasher texts were released in the 1980s, and many represent the paranoia of the time. Murr writes that horror is bound to the time period from which it sprang, and, like the previously discussed decades of horror, the 1980s were no exception. Anxieties about the Vietnam War and nuclear annihilation remained among audiences. Televisual coverage of violent crime and serial murder seemed to be growing, and the youth audience was becoming exponentially more profitable in Hollywood. There was a desire for horror that represented these anxieties, and the golden age of slasher provided that. Towards the latter half of the 80s, AIDS started a nationwide panic amongst audiences of a mysterious illness spread from person to person through bodily fluids. Largely affecting gay men and trans people of colour, queer people were dying in the streets and being largely ignored by the government, other than with homophobic comments and bitter laughter.
The horror genre became an apt place to examine these fears, and in the next episode I will discuss an evocative little slasher series about teenage bodies dying on the streets.
Hi, thank you so much for watching and congrats for getting this far. Please subscribe to my channel to catch the later parts of this series, and follow me on Twitter @VideoNasty, the same one that's spelled here, to see more hot takes on horror. Until I see you again, stay safe and stay spooky.